Hello. Winston Churchill said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." If that's the case, then I guess we're all doomed to repeat it because very few of us are learning history properly. What is going on in this field? Here to help me sort out the problems and identify some possible solutions is attorney, philosopher, and author James Valliant. James, great to see you as always.
Great to see you too, Nicholas. I hope you're doing just as spectacularly well as I am today.
I'm doing fabulously well. So most of us didn't actually have a proper history education. We learned something called social studies, which was a kind of a bizarre melange of a little bit of geography, a little bit of sort of pre-digested facts, and some political ideology thrown in. First of all, let's talk about the bad and get that out of the way. What is wrong with the social studies approach to teaching young people history?
Well, the first thing is what you just indicated there. It doesn't zero in on the topic of history as such at all yet. It's a little bit of civics and politics and, whatnot thrown in. And the other thing there is that generally speaking, well, there's two really terrible things that I think characterize historical education today. One is it's overtly anti-conceptual. There's some approaches that throw facts at kids in such a way that it makes it quite plain that there's no way to integrate this conceptually or inductively into anything that makes sense. If you approach it that way, it is just rote memorization of facts. And there's all kinds of subtle ways in which they're anti-conceptual, relativistic ways. Oh, well, you don't want to be Eurocentric in your view of history. You want to be a cultural relativist. And just because these people engage in human sacrifice or cannibalism, we can't evaluate that. And insofar as they don't allow people to draw, the student to allow conceptual generalizations from history, and alongside that, an evaluation of it, they're terrified of the evaluation of it. You can't evaluate this culture as superior to that culture, et cetera. It's an anti-conceptual, it's a disintegrating way of looking at history. Or the 5 different causes of the American Civil War. You begin, add a 6th, add a 7th, add an 8th. And that gives the impression that, oh, no, there's no way I can really understand what happened in the human past. The other thing is that they'll have, despite this anti-conceptual approach, they'll have some agenda, some political agenda, which is often get snuck in to those social science. I mean, I remember when I was in intermediate school and taking a course called Social Studies, my teacher had an overt politics that I could detect because he had a certain agenda. The exploitation of workers was just sort of built into the way he thought about things, and a Marxist premise. And without knowing it, he's conveying that to his students. I was sharp enough to identify, the little political aware kid I was sharp enough to identify that and insulate myself from that. Many students are not.
And the study of history has gotten much worse because now we have nonsense like the 1619 project. So you talked about the rote memorization of facts. Now it's really the rote memorization of rubbish. They're teaching kids now that capitalism was responsible for racism and sexism and slavery and all these kinds of idiocies. And you have to wonder what effect that's happening on our young generations.
Well, that is a bad conceptual model. That is a mistake. And that is why, the real way in which history, it's probably the single best way to teach inductive logic is through history. And if that's the way you're approaching it, then there's all kinds of opportunities to be able to see what is a bad argument in history, such as America is all about slavery. You can't understand anything about America unless you understand slavery, because that's what it's all about. Wow, is that a totally mistaken? I mean, then why on earth were the founding principles of America invoked to eliminate slavery during the Civil War? It causally breaks down. And exploring different causal hypotheses you can do that with history and knock them out, actually, as you study history. Of course, it depends on the level of education you're at, whether it's, there's a certain simple inductive lessons that can be drawn even in the most elementary explanations of history. well, gosh, there was a time before we had this medicine. Gosh, there was a time before, and you can explain the importance of studying history through simple things that most people, even when they're children, can grasp. And so on, first, very low order inductive generalizations can be brought about through the study of these facts. But if you're not doing that as a teacher, if you're not doing something like that, a conceptual integration, that I think is the worst thing. A bad conceptual integration, using Dr. Peikoff's language, a misintegration, such as the 1619 thing, is actually, it could be a pedagogical tool for the teaching of history. What is wrong with the 1619 theory? And open it up for discussion. Now, that's what you wouldn't find in a lot of these educational settings. They're going to jam the 1619 theory. This is the way it is, ladies and gentlemen. Kids, you're just going to have to accept this, rather than exploring it as a causal theory and knowing all the ways in which it is a stupid, dumb, contradictory, non-explanatory theory of history. It doesn't help to understand America. I mean, I'm not saying slavery wasn't an important part of American history or that it still has a legacy, not at all. But is that really the essence of American history, which is what the 1619 theory is all about?
A moment ago, you invoked some of the terminology from the dim hypothesis. I'm wondering, do you see history education today leaning more towards misintegration or disintegration? Because there's, on the one hand, you mentioned it's anti-conceptual, and it's definitely anti-integration. There's this myopic interest in specialization, particularly at the higher levels, say at the post-secondary level.
Yeah.
But then there's also a lot of just outright errors and falsehoods. So do you see it more leaning towards misintegration or disintegration?
I see both competing with one another. And I think Dr. Peikoff has laid out a conceptual framework in the dim hypothesis of historiography that is very valuable here. Valuable not only for we, the reader, trying to understand history, but for the teachers of history, pedagogically speaking. Because pedagogically speaking, that's exactly the alternative we're given. A disintegration model. There can be an infinite number of causes to the American Civil War. You just come up with another one. Or it's a total misintegration. Take the 1619 concept. And so what you have is, in effect, a competition, an active competition. Back in the old days, there were some better historians, mind you, even before objectivism, that were much more conceptual in their approach to history. I had a marvelous high school history teacher. She taught European history, and she taught it in a conceptual way. The Dark Ages, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. And without those kind of conceptual integrations, there's no way you're going to see the value of history, the importance of history, the relevance of history, or be able just simply to mentally retain it. People will often say to me, "Oh, Jim, you have this amazing recall for historical detail." It really isn't that I have a photograph. I do not have an eidetic or photographic memory. I have a conceptual approach, so that all I have to do is summon up the file folder Renaissance, and suddenly art and science and exploration, all these different political things going on in Europe, all of these things now spring to mind, so that now I have examples, from exploration, science, art, politics, religion, that integrate around the concept of Renaissance. And so a conceptual approach is really the only way to teach history, both in terms of the Crow epistemology, but in terms of getting them to understand inductively the actual causal mechanisms of history. And there's no doubt about it. It's a wonderful, history is an amazing super integrator too. I'm a big believer that education should be integrated in trying to tie various aspects of knowledge together. And what my answer just sort of brought up in my own head was this very important point about pedagogy and history. Science has a history. Industry has economics has a history. Art has a history. Politics has a history that's connected to everything else. And so it helps integrate the stuff, and it can help, as you go through education, integrate all the other stuff that the student is learning. And see the relevance of it, the importance of it. Gee, this Dark Age period didn't seem to have a lot of science going on. But then when you look at from the late 1500s through the 1800s, wow, there's this giant explosion. what can explain the difference, ladies and gentlemen, between this explosion during the age of science and enlightenment of new scientific thinking? Or what could explain the ancient Greeks? Why did they come up with philosophy and science in the first place? Those things need explanation, causal explanation, and getting the student to think about the difference between a dark age, and there's been more than one in the history of humanity, a dark age, and these brilliant periods of advance provides a classic opportunity for the integration of the rest of what they're learning and how to inductively infer from facts. History, like all other topics, is properly taught inductively. Getting the student to see that you can make sense out of history and that it is relevant and important and gives us lessons that apply to the here and now, getting back to Winston Churchill, so we're not doomed to repeat it.
So we've talked a little bit about methodology, the importance of an inductive approach, a conceptual approach. Let's talk a little bit about the actual content, starting with the primary and secondary levels. So just to take an example, I've read a little bit about the approach to history taken at the Van Damme Academy, and I know they go through a 3-year cycle where they go through ancient history, European history, and then American history. And they do this at all the different grade levels, from the primary through up to grade 8. What do you think of that approach in terms of, what I like about it is that it covers the breadth of history, it covers some of the most important periods. What are your thoughts on that approach?
Well, there is no egalitarian way to properly teach history. There are more important periods, and there are periods that need to be contrasted with other periods in order for this inductive mechanism to work. And getting back to that integrative aspect, one of the great things that Lisa Van Damme does is she does use history as an integrating mechanism, so that what they're learning in science or literature is, oh, I can see, oh, yeah. They can start putting together these inductive connections and generalizations for themselves. Is there a reason, ladies and gentlemen, why poetry, Italian poetry, went from Dante's Divine Comedy, which is discussing Christian metaphysics, to a century and a half later, the love poetry of Petrarch and Boccaccio? There's a cultural thing. What explains that difference in Italian poetry, right, from the 1300s to the 1500s? That kind of thing. That is exactly what I'm talking about. It is there. You can't be egalitarian. There are more important areas and topics, and we do have to have that evaluative mechanism as teachers of the topic. Now, the student obviously is only going to grasp that when it's all over. Your evaluative, but you're also encouraging their mechanism of thought. By having this evaluation that the teacher brings to it, you're actually eliciting them, even if they have other ideas, to come up with their own ideas, their own inductive generalizations about it. So yeah, I'm a big advocate of the way she approaches history. There are more important periods of history. There are conceptual ways of understanding this development, and it is interconnected to everything else that the student is learning. Those are the vital, I think, things. Ayn Rand, we were discussing before the show, Ayn Rand got her own university degree in history. She knew from a young age she wanted to be a fiction writer. And interesting, as the course of her own education, she had a high school teacher who thought that it would be a shame because she was so gifted as a mathematician. Gifted is the word they would use in those days. But she was so good at math that she loved it so math. It'd be a shame that if she didn't become a math teacher or an engineer or something. But no, that wasn't for Ayn Rand. But you'll notice she didn't study math, and she didn't study. She probably already had much of that down in her own head. But she didn't study literature, though. She studied history. History provides the factual basis for philosophical generalization. It is indispensable. By the time, obviously, you can't teach in the primary school level philosophy as such, but by the time they get mature enough to start thinking about philosophy, there is no more important factual basis someone can bring to the subject of philosophy, because philosophy is an inductive subject, than history and historical knowledge and the inductive inferences we reach in the study of history. Inductive inferences about humanity itself.
I quite like the way Dr. Peikoff puts it in his 1985 lecture series on the philosophy of education. He says, mathematics gives us the pattern of a proper epistemology. Science, physics gives us the content that we need for a proper metaphysics. And he says, history gives us the concretes from which we derive ethics and politics. So there's this very close connection between.
Absolutely correct. You know, and Ayn Rand said, this is an interesting point in the topic. Ayn Rand said that she might not have been able to come up with the idea of the role of reason in human survival, the very theme of Atlas Shrugged, before the Industrial Revolution. Technical and scientific progress was so slow that it wouldn't be apparent, perhaps within a single lifetime, the role of rational thought in human survival. The Industrial Revolution changed all that. Changes were happening at such a rapid rate that it's impossible to miss, at least for a genius like Ayn Rand, the role of reason in human survival.
Yeah, unfortunately, most 19th century philosophers did miss that connection.
Yes. Missed it. They missed it quite the opposite. The most glorious thing in the history of humankind on this planet, human life expectancy, human population, human well-being, human health and safety exploded in the 19th century. And far from historians and political thinkers saying, well, how do we explain this amazing, wonderful thing? They denounced it. They denounced it as evil. They were utterly blind to the tremendous benefits that were going on all around them because of the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism. All of that went not only unrecognized, but anti-recognized in the sense that they were denouncing the industrial leaders as robber barons and so forth. And so it's not that as a history teacher, I wouldn't cover the theory of robber barons, but you could show you could use it as a case study in bad generalization, bad historical inference, bad induction.
Continuing with my question about early education in history, primary, secondary, are there special challenges in introducing very young children to history, say at a kindergarten level, very early level, just getting them interested in the subject and making it relevant to them? How do you convince a child who's 5 or 6 years old to take an interest in ancient Egypt or ancient Greece? How do you make it come alive?
Well, all I can do is give you a little autobiographical. I wrote a book about history, Creating Christ, and I've loved history. It's been a passion of mine since I was very, very young. And I look back on my own history, and one of the very first books I ever read was a children's biography of Abraham Lincoln. I don't remember the author's name, but I remember the title, Abe Lincoln Gets His Chance. And it's a children's book designed for young primary school students who've just learned to read, maybe second, third graders. But it was one of the very first books I can remember reading. And it was just a story of a guy, the story of a young man who was raised by illiterates in the wilderness in a log cabin, who in effect taught himself, and it was an autodidact, and he had some help, but by candlelight, he basically taught himself how to read. And before it was all over, he would be a self-educated, classically educated, eloquent, one of the greatest lawyers in American history, and then a president of the United States who would end slavery. And with just that thought out there, they're not explaining the rest of Abraham Lincoln's history. They're just giving you how Abraham Lincoln as a kid, with children's history, as a kid, came to be Abraham Lincoln. I found that utterly, utterly fascinating. I found it inspiring, his personal story. And that's how it's through stories like that that I think are the first, entree to history. I also loved Greek mythology as a kid. Just fascinating stories. They're like comic books to me. I would read, children's introductions or simple introductions like Edith Hamilton's to mythology, and that would get me interested in the other literature in time. But those stories said, these people had some interesting the thoughts here, and they were thinking about philosophy through these stories. And I couldn't name it in those terms as a kid, but that's what was interesting me at the time about Greek mythology. Who were these Greeks? What they did have these different views than what we have, and a whole different approach to the universe itself. And that's how I think we do it. What we do is we stimulate kids through interesting people, interesting that they might relate to, or interesting topics in history that again will stimulate some further research and get them to at least to see that there's a topic that they'll want to study in greater depth self-consciously.
And of course, stories is precisely what most of our modern historians object to. They'll say, no, there are no grand narratives, there are no great men in history. Yeah, leave them aside. But on the subject of children's books, are you familiar with Ernst Gombrich's Little History of the World? He was a German-American art historian. He wrote The Story of Art, which is one of the most famous books on the history of art.
Oh yeah,
I
know the name. Yeah,
it's called A Little History of the World. Apparently, he wrote it for his own children.
I'm not familiar with that book. I'm sorry to say I'm not familiar with that book, but now you've got me interested. Now I have to go check it out. Yeah, that's exactly, you make a great point though. It is exactly these conceptual narratives that that a lot of people object to, and they can object to it from one of two perspectives, it seems to me. A disintegrative perspective. Well, you're painting, this is the way I would, if I propose a generalization about history, even at the university level, mind you, I remember one history professor of mine saying, Mr. Valliant, you paint in broad strokes. Right? Or you'd hear it's the other side of the, oh, that's too simple. It's simplification, it's simplicity. No. That's an anti-conceptual D approach whenever you hear that. Or well, you've left out another potential narrative, which is equally valid. That's the D approach. But then, of course, you've got the M approach. Oh, that's not consistent with my view of history. Oh, you mean the Declaration of Independence? Saying all men are created equal had something to do with the world ending slavery? Oh, well, that might fly in the face of the 1619 Project there. It might fly in the face that Abraham Lincoln is citing the founding principles of America to turn the Civil War into a cause against slavery. So it would be the 1619 people with their misintegration of history. They're going to say, no, that conceptualization is out because it contradicts my M. So you've got both enemies here feeding into that, saying, yeah, there's no way to conceptually order history. One of the worst ways in which history can be taught is anti-chronologically. It's not that history always has to be taught in chronological fashion. I think there are contexts for the advanced study of history which are not necessarily chronological. But when initially learning history, the logic is already given there. And the primary aspect of that, the factual assumption underneath all of it, is there's a chronology. This happened first, then that, and that's how we can start to develop causal generalizations about it. But there are those who approach history in an anti-chronological way, intentionally disintegrating the student's mind so that they don't see things in a chronological, oh, this developed from that, we're doing the History of Philosophy course of Leonard Peikoff on Sundays, and I want to put a plug in for Ayn Rand Center UK. Become a member because you can participate in these discussions we have on Sunday on Leonard Peikoff's course on the history of philosophy. But if you really want to understand how we got to the state we are in now philosophically, you have to understand the history of philosophy. There's no better way to understand some concepts in philosophy than through studying the history of philosophy. Just look at what Plato said, and he was the first guy that said this, or Heraclitus or Parmenides. It is a chronological, developmental way that history has to be laid out, at least initially to the student. And that logic is sort of built in. And when I see that logic violated, and it's violated all the time, and it's most egregious, as I say, at the primary level, it's like you're disintegrating the student's mind from ever being conceptual about history. That's a nightmare.
Absolutely. So I'm going to ask a few questions about post-secondary study of history in a moment, but let's check in with our producer, Daniel. And are there any super chats or comments at the moment?
We have a few super chats. So first, thank you, Jonathan. He sent a super sticker. Thank you, Gail, as well. She also sent a super sticker. And thank you, Jonathan, again and again and again. He sent a couple of more super stickers. And then he sent a super chat and he said, James is gold.
Well, Thank you all very much.
Last I checked, I'm still flesh and blood. But thank you very much. I love history. It's a passion of mine. And I've had such good history teachers. Like I say, from high school, I had a brilliant conceptual. She was no objectivist, but she approached the subject conceptually. By the time I got to know Leonard Peikoff, before he had written the dim hypothesis, when I was privileged enough to be a student of Dr. Peikoff's in his home, one of the subjects that he and I discussed most frequently was history and historiography, because we were both very, very much interested in it. So hopefully I've learned a few things from some good teachers. I've done some research in this field myself. So thank you very much for that wonderful compliment and your support.
Absolutely. Turning now to post-secondary education, what advice would you give to somebody who wants to study history at a higher level, say at a master's level or a PhD? I mean, besides don't do it, because the field is so corrupt, but for somebody who really wants to pursue history, what kind of advice would you give in terms of finding a good program, finding a supervisor who is not hostile to the conceptual integrated approach? What are some things to think about?
There are better historians in the past, and historians of particular subjects. We were discussing, you were discussing, for example, Will Durant. Wow, what an understanding of cultural history he brings. And whether I always agree with him or not is secondary to the fact that he takes the proper scope of history. Lord Acton, the English, this is 130, 40 years ago, Lord Acton brought German scientific historical methods to the English-speaking world, and of course became Lord Acton. Jacob Bernowski on the history of science. As I say, there's various kinds of history, some histories of art, like you say. I would look for the right kind of specialization and the kind of specialization that interests you. Once you get to the university level, sure, you're going to need to have a general understanding of historiography. You're going to need to specialize in a certain field. Learning another language is absolutely indispensable if you want to learn how to do historical research on a particular culture or a particular time. No question about that. But when you're getting to the university level, now you're getting into historical research. How do we know what we know? And getting to the sources for the source. No longer will a textbook do. Seems to me we have to penetrate to our actual historical sources. What are our sources of information? Archaeology, numismology, coins. What's our physical evidence? What are the reports? What are the written records from that time? Do we have government records, economic records, those kind of things? Penetrating into that and finding a good scientific historian, I use the word specifically, scientific researcher who can teach you. And I would say focus, specialize, especially if you want to get a graduate level degree, focus on something, archaeology, numismology, the history of religion, the history of philosophy, something like that, that's going to be your specialization, learn. You have to, there are technical things that you simply have to learn about historical methodology if you really want to understand how we know what we know, insofar as we know it about history.
I definitely see the value of specialization, but from what I've heard about the field of history today, there's a tendency towards fragmentation, towards a real hostility to integration. Just, for somebody who wants to get a very broad understanding of history, yes, still with a specialization, but who wants to know about ancient history, modern history, there seems to be a real hostility to that in the field today.
Even if you study in a particular I'm going to learn, the history of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain during the 18th century. Even if you're specializing in a particular area, that is no excuse for understanding the general proposition. How many times, I mean, you could give you some examples. Studying ancient history. Well, we can see that that without even thinking about it, these ancient historians will talk Keynesian or Marxist economics. Well, obviously there was overproduction there, or obviously it was an exploitation of the workers issue here. And they're talking about some, prehistoric time where we're trying to understand politically. And without knowing it, they're going to bring in these misintegrations. So you have to be a generalist in that sense. We have to. Philosophy is inescapable. You have to have a philosophy of history. And that's going to be the master integrator of everything that you do in history. And it's going to affect every specialist. There is no archaeologist, for example, who isn't affected, whether it's Marxist or Keynesian economics that he's bringing to it. Now, we do our best to put that aside. A lot of these people simply can't. But at some level, you can't. At some level, philosophy is going to inform the way you approach history. And I include in that the value subjects. I can't tell you, I mean, university, I'm being told, Jim, why are you negatively evaluating the Aztecs? Just because they were engaging in human sacrifice and tearing the hearts out of children on the top of their temples. There's no reason for you to be so negative about the Aztec. No, they're an inferior primitive culture, I would say. Oh, well, Jim, you're obviously bringing your Western-centric values here, and we have to be totally relativistic about it. No, there's no way that you can avoid philosophy, and your philosophy will shape the way you approach history. That just goes without saying. As I say, there are still better, more conceptual, even non-objectivist historians out there who've done some amazing work. But even they're be on guard. Even they're be on guard for the conceptual generalizations they do draw, because sometimes we'll disagree with them because they don't have the right philosophy. So philosophy is inescapable, and it will be the master integrator, and it will inform the premises that will condition how people look at whatever your specialization is, whether it's ancient history, archaeology, or some specific topic from modern history. But for the professionals, they are going to go into some kind of specialization. And you have to know as you go into that specialization that what your philosophy is in the first instance, or that specialization you're just going to be lost in. You're going to be leaning to a D or an M per force.
Absolutely. One other question I'd like to ask: do you have a list, or can you give us a list of your top five favorite historians, or top five favorite books about history from the past?
Wow, that's a good one. You know, a book that had a huge impact on me, it's a classic book, Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. What an astonishing book. I mentioned Lord Acton before. What a powerful impact he had on me.
What are his most famous works?
Well, the problem with Lord Acton is that his greatest book was a book that was never written. He was going to write a master history of Western civilization from the standpoint of liberty, the history of liberty. Huh. Can you imagine what that book would have been? But we do have his lectures, his essays that were all designed in preparation for that masterwork. So there are good places where you can find the collected essays and speeches of Lord Acton, but that's really what we have from Lord Acton. That's what I'd recommend you read, because alas, he never did complete his monumental history of liberty and Western civilization that he had planned. When it comes to certain specific areas, I mentioned earlier, Jacob Bronowski. Well, he had a huge impact on me. When I was just a kid, I saw the series that they did on his book, The Ascent of Man. That got me to get to the book. And boy, talk about teaching me a great deal about the history of science. The history of science. And as I say, every field has a history to it. The history of science in itself is so valuable. I highly recommend Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man if you just want an introduction to the history of science. Gosh, I could go on and on and on. But there are outstanding history books out there that do approach it conceptually and that are very, very helpful.
Good. And I'll just one more time put in a plug for my hero, Will Durant, one of the greatest integrators of all time, philosopher, historian. His 11-volume Story of Civilization, fantastic read. I'm partway through volume 2. Check in with me in a year or so. I'll let you know how far I've gotten. But he's also written some shorter books like Heroes of History, Lessons of History, which anyone who just wants a quick overview, I would highly recommend those. And they were written with the layperson in mind. So they're very readable.
I myself grew up with Will Durant. My grandmother happened to know him and work with him. So.
And he writes so beautifully. He has
so beautifully,
prose style.
Right.
He's just a joy to read.
A joy to read, and talk about a conceptual approach to history. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, let's check in with Daniel one more time. Do we have any announcements and any final super chats or comments from our viewers?
We have a super chat from Christopher. Thank you so much. And also a super chat question from Rhett. He's asking, should students of history be concerned about their teachers presenting historical facts in a misleading way to support their erroneous philosophy?
That's a good question.
Yeah, and a simple answer, yes. Simple answer is yes. Be on guard for all the BSMs that are out there, because there are a lot of misintegrations that are just poor history. Marxist approach to history, the materialist approach to history and economic factors to history, or the natural resources, country X is richer than country Y because of natural resources. You'll still hear stupid theories like that. So, and some of them are easier for the bright student to be aware of and avoid, but some of them are very subtle. And can be destructive of our desire, our motive. I can't understand it, especially the D leaners. But even if it's a bad M, it can diffuse someone's motive to even understand the subject, because it's not providing helpful causal explanations. It's not helping us to do our philosophical induction, for which it is an indispensable database.
It always breaks my heart whenever I hear one of my students, and most of my students are older adults, much older than I am. Whenever they say, "Oh, I never liked history when I was in school. I never enjoyed it. I don't want to learn about history." It's a tragedy, really. I think the privilege of learning about history, learning about the past, is everybody's birthright, and it's a shame when bad teachers, bad mythologies diffuse the joy that one can get out of this subject. James,
I just love it aesthetically, because humans are of such interest to me. It's true, but it is also of burning importance, mentally speaking. Thank you, Nicholas. What a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your expertise to bear on this subject. Daniel, any final announcements or super chats before we sign off?
So there are no upcoming shows today, but we'll be back tomorrow with the daily objective, the Thursday collective edition. Okay, excellent. Thank you again, James. It's a pleasure talking to you as always. We'll do it again very soon. And until then, have a great day, everyone. And I wish you all the best of premises. See you soon.
Be well.